If you think that simply cutting off the supply of Nvidia H100 chips is enough to strangle China's artificial intelligence, you are dead wrong. While Washington tightens sanctions, inside the research labs of Beijing, a technological prison break of unprecedented scale is unfolding. They aren't relying on the world's most expensive silicon anymore. Instead, they are taking hardware scraps and combining them with ingenious algorithms to create a power that rivals GPT-4. How does a model built for just $6 million challenge a billion-dollar empire? This is the story of DeepSeek and the secret art of extreme optimization. Today, we're going behind the silicon curtain to see how China is hacking its way through the hardware blockade. We aren't just talking about a new app, we're talking about a fundamental shift in the global AI war, where brain power is starting to outrun raw computing muscle. Welcome to the era of the AI firewall and the engineers who just found the back door. To understand how they breached the wall, we have to step inside the brain of the AI, where mathematics is replacing the brute force of silicon. For years, the industry followed a bigger is better mantra: more chips, more power, more parameters. But when the US slammed the door on high-end Nvidia exports, China's engineers couldn't afford to be big. They had to be smart. Enter the technique that changed everything: mixture of experts, or MOE. Think of a traditional AI model like a massive 1,000-page encyclopedia. Every time you ask a simple question, like how do I boil an egg, the AI has to flip through every single page to find the answer. It's exhaustive, it's slow, and it requires a massive amount of computing muscle to keep that entire book open at once. This is why OpenAI and Google need tens of thousands of H100 chips running at full throttle. But DeepSeek took a different path. Instead of one giant encyclopedia, they built a library of specialized experts. In an MOE architecture, when you ask a question, the system doesn't activate the whole model. It triggers a router that identifies exactly which small section, which expert, is best suited for that specific task. Only 5% or 10% of the total brain power is activated at any given time. The result? You get the same high-quality answer, but you use a fraction of the electricity and, more importantly, a fraction of the hardware power. It is the ultimate lemon-squeezing technique. They are getting every drop of performance out of every single transistor. But here's where the technical brilliance meets the geopolitical reality. China isn't just optimizing software, they're Frankensteining their hardware. Since they can't buy the latest Nvidia H100s or B200s, they've become masters of heterogeneous computing. This is a fancy way of saying they're making different types of chips talk to each other in ways they weren't originally designed. In Chinese data centers today, you won't just find a uniform row of identical GPUs. Instead, you see a strategic mix. They're pairing older, legacy Nvidia chips, the ones that escaped the ban or were stockpiled years ago, with domestic newcomers like the Huawei Ascend 910B. Normally, trying to make a Huawei chip work in perfect sync with an Nvidia chip is a software nightmare. It's like trying to have a conversation where one person speaks Mandarin and the other speaks Spanish, yet they need to finish each other's sentences in milliseconds. However, Chinese labs have developed proprietary bridging layers. These software stacks smooth over the differences in architecture, allowing domestic chips to handle the heavy lifting, while the Nvidia chips manage the complex data routing. By utilizing MOE, they don't need a massive cluster of identical superchips, they just need enough power at the right moment. This shift from brute force to efficiency is a wake-up call. For the first time, we're seeing evidence that the hardware gap might not be the capability gap we once thought. While Western companies are competing to see who can build the largest, most expensive data centers on Earth, Chinese engineers are proving that if your math is good enough, you can win the race with half the engine. But wait, if they're so good at math, does that mean the US sanctions have failed entirely? Not quite. Because even with the best algorithms, you still need silicon. You still need a physical place for that math to live. And as the demand for AI grows, China's expert algorithms are hitting a new, much more physical wall. It's one thing to build a clever brain, it's another thing entirely to find the raw materials to keep that brain alive in a world where the supply chain is being used as a weapon. And that brings us to the shadowy world of the chip underground. But as clever as an algorithm can be, it still needs flesh in the form of hardware. And when the front door is locked and bolted, China has found thousands of windows left wide open. To understand the scale of this operation, we have to look into the shadows. While the headlines focus on official trade bans, a massive underground economy is humming. It's a world where a shipping container labeled as home appliances might actually hold a fortune in high-end silicon. According to reports from the Financial Times and investigative journalists on the ground, the chip smuggling trade has become as lucrative and as organized as any illicit substance. But how do you smuggle something that requires a massive supply chain to function? The answer is the Great Rerouting. Middlemen companies in countries like the United Arab Emirates, Singapore, and even parts of Europe have become black boxes. They purchase the latest Nvidia chips under the guise of local infrastructure projects. Once the chips land, they vanish from official records, only to reappear weeks later in the server rooms of Shenzhen or Beijing. It's a high-stakes shell game that leaves regulators chasing ghosts. But it's not just about what's coming in, it's about what was already there. Remember the great crypto crash? When Bitcoin and Ethereum mining became less profitable, thousands of mining farms across the globe went dark. These farms were packed with GPUs. Older, yes, but still incredibly capable when used in parallel. Industry insiders describe a process of digital cannibalization. Chinese tech firms have been quietly scouring the global market, buying up used mining rigs and butchering them for their chips. They're stripping these cards down, resoldering the chips onto new boards, and clustering them by the thousands. It's a patchwork labor of love and desperation. It may not be as efficient as a brand new H100 cluster from an authorized distributor, but in a war of attrition, good enough is a winning strategy. However, stockpiling and smuggling are only short-term fixes. You can't build a 10-year AI strategy on what you can find in a back alley. This is where the Financial Times highlights a critical shift. China is no longer just looking for the newest chips, they are hoarding the oldest ones. Why? Because older generation chips, the ones that fall just below the threshold of the US sanctions, are easier to acquire in bulk, easier to maintain, and most importantly, their architecture is a known quantity. When your goal is to optimize every single electron through software, as we discussed with DeepSeek's Mo architecture, having a predictable, older chip is often better than having a smuggled new chip you can't get tech support for. But there is a darker side to this investigative trail. The pressure to Zhao to leap over the barrier has led to a state of hyper-competition inside China. It's not just China versus the US anymore, it's Chinese tech giant versus Chinese tech giant, all fighting over the same dwindling pool of high-end silicon. Imagine the tension. You are a lead engineer at a lab like DeepSeek. You have the world's most efficient code, but your rival at Alibaba or Baidu just outbid you for a secret shipment of GPUs coming through Malaysia. The chip war isn't just a geopolitical map, it's a boardroom knife fight. This desperation has birthed a unique kind of resilience. While the West views the hardware ban as a definitive stop sign, the Chinese tech ecosystem views it as a technical constraint to be solved. They aren't just breaking the law, they're rewriting the rules of how a tech industry survives under siege. Yet as we peel back the layers of this investigation, a bigger question emerges. If China can maintain its momentum through smuggling, hoarding, and cannibalizing old hardware, what happens when they actually start producing their own high-end silicon at scale? What happens when the scraps are replaced by a domestic supply chain that Washington can't touch? Because while the US is focused on stopping the chips of today, they might be missing the fact that they've forced their greatest rival to build the industry of tomorrow. And that brings us to the most uncomfortable realization of all, the efficiency trap. Everything we've discussed, the smuggled chips, the cannibalized mining rigs, the expert routing algorithms, leads us to a pivotal realization. We are witnessing two fundamentally different philosophies of evolution. In the West, specifically in Silicon Valley, the strategy is brute force. If a model isn't smart enough, throw another $1 billion at it, build a bigger data center, buy another 100,000 Nvidia GPUs. It is a philosophy of abundance, where capital is the primary weapon. But in the East, out of sheer necessity, a new philosophy has emerged: lean intelligence. When you are starving, you learn to digest every single nutrient. This efficiency trap is something the US might not be prepared for. While American big tech firms are locked in a spending war, bloating their balance sheets to maintain their lead, Chinese labs are perfecting the art of doing more with less. They are treating computing power like a precious, finite resource, much like water in a desert. And this brings us to the concept of ASIC, application-specific integrated circuits. For the longest time, Nvidia's H100 was the Swiss Army knife of AI. It can do everything. But a Swiss Army knife is rarely the best tool for a specific job. Big tech giants like Google with their TPUs and Amazon with their Trainium chips have realized this. They are building chips designed for one specific task and one specific algorithm. China is now forced to follow this exact path at an accelerated rate. By designing domestic chips like the Huawei Ascend 910B to work specifically with their localized Mo frameworks, they are stripping away the fat of general-purpose computing. The question we have to ask is the US being too wasteful? Think about it. If you can achieve 95% of the performance of a GPT-4 model using only 10% of the budget and older hardware, the economic gravity of the entire industry shifts. In the long run, the winner of the AI war might not be the one with the biggest supercomputer, but the one who creates the most sustainable, cost-effective intelligence. If AI becomes a commodity like electricity or oil, the cost of production becomes the only thing that matters. By forcing China to innovate under extreme scarcity, the US sanctions may have inadvertently gifted them the ultimate competitive advantage: frugality. While American companies are building Ferraris that require specialized fuel and perfect roads, China is building rugged off-roaders that can run on anything. They are building a supply chain that doesn't rely on the global status quo. They are investing in specialized silicon that they own from the architecture up to the final transistor. This isn't just about a catch-up game anymore. This is a fork in the road of human history. On one path, we have the centralized, high-cost, high-energy model of the West. On the other, we see a decentralized, hyper-optimized, lean model emerging from the East. If the hardware wall continues to hold, China will be forced to become the world leader in software-driven hardware optimization. They will find ways to make a 5-year-old chip perform like a brand new one. And when the sanctions eventually lift, or when China's own 7-nanometer or 5-nanometer production lines finally stabilize, they won't just have the hardware, they will have the most efficient software in human history to run on it. The scraps we see today are the building blocks of a new kind of empire. An empire built not on the luxury of having everything, but on the lethal skill of needing almost nothing. But where does this leave the rest of us? In a world where AI is the new nuclear power, is efficiency enough to maintain a global balance? Or are we heading towards a future where the digital divide is no longer between the haves and have-nots, but between those who can afford the truth and those who can only afford the optimized version of it? As we look at the wreckage of the global supply chain, one thing is certain. The Buktung Lia, the firewall, isn't just keeping information in, it's forcing a transformation that the world is not yet ready to face. In the end, the global AI chip war is no longer a simple race of who has the most hardware. It has evolved into a much more profound contest of human intellect and the strategic use of limited resources. What we are seeing from China isn't just a survival tactic. It is proof that adversity is often the ultimate cradle of breakthrough innovation.
By attempting to lock the doors, the world may have inadvertently forced a sleeping giant to reinvent the very foundation of how artificial intelligence works. The AI firewall was meant to contain a rival, but instead it has birthed a new philosophy of efficiency that could eventually challenge the dominance of Silicon Valley's high-cost model. It reminds us that in the digital age, a sharp mind will always find a way to outpace a heavy hammer. But this journey is far from over. We are standing at a crossroads where the future of technology could split into two entirely different worlds. In your opinion, can a brilliantly lean algorithm truly defeat the brute force of millions of superchips in the long run? Or is this just a temporary, desperate measure by China that will eventually hit a physical ceiling? The stakes couldn't be higher, and your perspective matters. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and I want to know if you think efficiency or raw power will win this war. If you found this deep dive insightful, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to stay ahead of the curve in this rapidly changing global landscape. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next analysis where we continue to decode the world of finance and technology.